David wiped the freezing rain from his jaw, staring up at the towering glass monolith of Kensington Holdings. Inside those walls sat the woman who controlled his paycheck, his career, and now, his entire future. Victoria Kensington was a ruthless billionaire CEO who fired executives for simply clearing their throats in meetings. They had shared exactly one night of unguarded passion after a brutal negotiation. Now, standing in the cold, he still couldn't process the terrifying 4 words she had just whispered. David Henderson's alarm clock screamed at 5:15 a.m., pulling him from a fitful, stress-laden sleep. The Seattle rain was lashing against the thin windowpane of his modest 2-bedroom apartment, a sound he had grown to associate with the relentless grind of his life. At 32, David was the senior acquisitions manager at Kensington Global, a commercial real estate empire. But more importantly, he was a single father to a 6-year-old girl named Chloe. His ex-wife, a restless, aspiring actress named Jessica, had walked out on them 3 years ago, claiming she wasn't built for motherhood or the crushing weight of ordinary life. She had boarded a flight to Los Angeles and never looked back, leaving David with a mountain of shared debt, a broken heart, and a beautiful little girl who constantly asked when her mommy was coming home. Since then, David's entire existence had been narrowed down to 2 things: keeping Chloe happy and keeping his high-paying, high-stress job. Kensington Global was not a place for the weak. The company was spearheaded by Victoria Kensington, a 35-year-old billionaire heiress who had taken her grandfather's company and turned it into an international juggernaut. Victoria was notoriously cold. She was a vision of corporate intimidation, always dressed in immaculate Tom Ford suits, her ash-blonde hair pulled into a severe chignon, her icy blue eyes capable of dismantling a grown man's confidence in seconds. She drank her espresso black, sourced exclusively from a private roaster in Colombia, and she demanded nothing short of absolute perfection from her staff. For 6 months, David's division had been locked in a brutal battle to acquire a multi-billion-dollar waterfront property known as the Harbor Point Project. The pressure from the executive floor had been crushing. David had worked 80-hour weeks, missing Chloe's school plays and relying heavily on a teenage babysitter he could barely afford, all to ensure the deal went through. It all culminated on a bleak Friday evening in late November. The entire 48th floor of the Kensington Tower was empty, save for David and Victoria. The final contracts had been signed at 9:00 p.m. The Harbor Point project officially belonged to Kensington Global. The silence in the massive executive suite was deafening, broken only by the hum of the city below and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. David was exhausted, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up, rubbing his burning eyes. He was packing his briefcase, desperate to get home to relieve the babysitter, when Victoria's voice cut through the silence. "Don't leave yet, Henderson." He looked up. Victoria was standing by a custom mahogany wet bar in the corner of her sprawling office. She was pouring a deeply amber liquid from a crystal decanter into 2 heavy glasses. For the first time since he had known her, she looked human. Her tailored blazer was draped over the back of her leather chair. She had kicked off her Christian Louboutin heels, standing barefoot on the Persian rug. "We just closed the largest acquisition in this firm's history," Victoria said, walking over and holding out a glass of Macallan 25-year-old scotch. "Drink with me." David hesitated. "Ms. Kensington, I really should get back to my daughter. The sitter charges overtime after 10. "Victoria," she corrected softly, her voice losing its usual sharp edge. "Tonight, just call me Victoria, and I will cover the sitter's overtime. Please, just 1 drink." Reluctantly, David took the glass. The scotch burned smoothly down his throat. He expected her to talk about the financial projections or the upcoming press release. But instead, she leaned against the edge of her massive glass desk and sighed. It was a heavy, weary sound that completely shattered her Iron Maiden persona. "Do you ever feel like you're just a machine running on borrowed electricity, David?" she asked, staring out at the glittering skyline. "Like everyone looks at you and sees a bank account, or a stepping stone, or a target, but nobody actually sees you." David was taken aback. "I suppose I feel like a machine sometimes," he admitted carefully. "But usually it's an ATM for my mortgage lender and my daughter's pediatrician." A faint, genuine smile touched Victoria's lips. It transformed her face, making her look breathtakingly beautiful. They began to talk. The conversation flowed effortlessly, fueled by the premium scotch and the adrenaline crash of the massive deal. David found himself telling her about Jessica leaving, about the terrifying weight of raising Chloe alone, about the nights he sat awake wondering if he was ruining his daughter's life by working so much. In turn, Victoria stripped away her armor. She spoke of her father's suffocating expectations, the betrayal of her former fiancé who had tried to steal her shares, and the profoundly isolating nature of immense wealth. "I have thousands of employees, David," she whispered, stepping closer to him, the scent of her Baccarat Rouge 540 perfume filling his senses. "And I have never felt more alone than I do in this room." The tension shifted, thickening into something dangerous. David saw the vulnerability in her eyes, a desperate need to be held without condition. When she reached out and touched his jaw, her fingers trembling slightly. Logic completely evaporated. The exhaustion, the stress, the months of pent-up energy all ignited at once. David pulled her in, and the billionaire ice queen melted in his arms. The night that followed was a blur of frantic, unguarded passion against the backdrop of the Seattle skyline. A desperate escape for two people drowning in their own lives. David woke up to the harsh, unforgiving glare of the morning sun reflecting off the glass towers of downtown Seattle. He was lying on the sprawling leather Chesterfield sofa in Victoria's office. For a brief, disorienting second, he didn't know where he was. Then the memories of the previous night came rushing back in a tidal wave of panic. He sat up quickly, his heart hammering against his ribs. The office was immaculate. The empty crystal glasses had been cleared away. And sitting behind her massive desk, typing furiously on her laptop, was Victoria Kensington. She was back in full armor. Her hair was perfectly pinned, her makeup flawless, dressed in a sharp navy blue suit. She didn't even look up as David scrambled to find his tie and jacket. "Good morning, David!" Her voice was brisk, entirely devoid of the warmth and vulnerability that had consumed her hours earlier. "The press release for Harbor Point goes live at 9. I need you to coordinate with the PR department and have the quarterly risk assessments on my desk by noon." David stood there, his tie dangling awkwardly from his hand, feeling like he had just been slapped across the face. The message was explicitly clear. "Last night never happened. You are an employee. I am the CEO." "Right." David swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "By noon. Understood. Ms. Kensington." He walked out of the executive suite with a heavy knot in his stomach. The transition back to reality was brutal. He raced home, overpaid his furious teenage babysitter, showered, made Chloe her favorite dinosaur-shaped pancakes, and dropped her off at elementary school before sprinting back to the office. For the next 8 weeks, life returned to its grueling baseline. The holidays came and went. David bought Chloe a dollhouse he had to assemble until 3 in the morning on Christmas Eve. At work, Victoria was colder and more demanding than ever. She criticized his reports, pushed impossible deadlines, and maintained a strictly professional, almost hostile distance. But sometimes, during crowded board meetings, David would catch her staring at him, not with the fierce, calculating glare of a CEO, but with a look of quiet, internal panic. He convinced himself he was imagining things. He convinced himself that their one night together was just a desperate anomaly that would be buried forever in corporate history. Then came the annual Kensington Global Shareholder Gala in late January. It was a lavish affair held at the historic Fairmont Olympic Hotel. The grand ballroom was dripping with crystal chandeliers, overflowing with white orchids, and packed with Seattle's elite. David was there in a rented tuxedo, nursing a cheap glass of club soda by the ice sculpture, feeling entirely out of place. He was only invited because of his role in the Harbor Point acquisition. Across the room, Victoria was holding court. She wore a stunning emerald green gown that clung perfectly to her figure, surrounded by wealthy investors and aggressive corporate rivals. One of them was Arthur Pendleton, a ruthless, silver-haired board member who constantly sought to undermine Victoria's authority and seize control of the company. David watched from afar as Arthur cornered Victoria, his smile venomous, clearly pressing her on some corporate matter. Suddenly, Victoria turned away from the group. David noticed her face was unusually pale, almost gray. She set her champagne flute down on a passing tray without having taken a single sip, highly uncharacteristic for her at these events. She caught David's eye across the crowded room and gave a nearly imperceptible nod toward the hallway leading to the private cloakrooms. David's pulse spiked. He waited a full minute before casually maneuvering through the crowd of billionaires and socialites, slipping out through the heavy mahogany doors. The hallway was dimly lit and mercifully quiet, muffled jazz music playing softly from the ballroom behind them. Victoria was standing near a velvet-draped alcove, clutching her clutch purse so tightly her knuckles were white. When David approached, he was shocked by her appearance up close. She looked physically ill, her breathing shallow, the confident billionaire facade completely shattered. "Victoria, are you all right?" David asked, instinctively stepping forward. "Do you need me to get security?" "Was it Pendleton?" "No," she breathed, leaning back against the wall, closing her eyes. "It's not Arthur." "Then what is it?" "You look like you're going to pass out." Victoria opened her icy blue eyes, now wide with an emotion David had never seen in her before. Sheer, unadulterated terror. She looked around the empty hallway, ensuring no one was lingering nearby, then stepped into David's personal space. The familiar scent of Baccarat Rouge hit him, violently pulling him back to that rainy night in her office. She reached out, her perfectly manicured hand trembling, and grabbed the lapel of his rented tuxedo. She pulled him down slightly, her lips hovering just an inch from his ear. "I'm pregnant," his boss whispered, her voice cracking. David froze. The blood drained from his face, the grand jazz music from the ballroom suddenly fading into a high-pitched ringing in his ears. His mind scrambled, desperately trying to do the terrifying math. Late November, late January, 8 weeks. David stammered, stepping back, his hands completely numb. "Are you sure?" "Is it?" "I have taken 5 tests," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a fierce, desperate hiss. "And my private doctor confirmed it this morning. I haven't been with anyone else in 2 years. David, it's yours." Before David could even form a coherent sentence, the heavy mahogany doors swung open. Arthur Pendleton strolled into the hallway, his cold eyes darting between the pale CEO and her stunned acquisitions manager. A sly, dangerous smile spread across the older man's face as he sensed the thick, suffocating tension between them. David realized in that split second that his life as a quiet and struggling single father was over, and he had just been dragged into the most dangerous game in Seattle, and he had no idea how to survive it. Arthur Pendleton took a slow, calculated sip of his bourbon, his pale gray eyes darting between Victoria and David. The silence in the dimly lit hallway was suddenly heavier than lead. The muffled jazz from the ballroom felt entirely disconnected from the suffocating tension radiating between the three of them. "Am I interrupting a private negotiation, Victoria?" Arthur asked, his voice dripping with faux politeness. "Or perhaps a reprimand? Mr. Henderson looks as though he's just seen a ghost." David's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He opened his mouth, desperately trying to formulate a plausible lie, but Victoria was faster. In a fraction of a second, the terrified, vulnerable woman vanished, replaced instantly by the ruthless billionaire CEO. "A reprimand, Arthur," Victoria stated, her voice as hard and brittle as winter ice. She stepped back from David, smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her emerald gown. "Mr. Henderson was just attempting to justify a discrepancy I found in the Harbor Point Phase 2 integration reports, a discrepancy I expect resolved before Monday morning, David, or we will be having a very different conversation with HR." David swallowed hard, catching her drift perfectly. "Yes, Ms. Kensington. I'll have the revised numbers on your desk by 8. Arthur's gaze lingered on David for a moment too long, a predator smelling blood in the water. "Fascinating," the older man murmured, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I always found your attention to detail impeccable. Victoria, it would be a shame if distractions began to cloud your judgment. The board relies on your absolute focus, especially with the quarterly review approaching." "My focus is exactly where it needs to be," Victoria countered smoothly. "Enjoy the gala, Arthur." Without waiting for a response, she turned on her heel and walked back toward the ballroom, her posture rigid, her chin held high. David waited a beat, offering Arthur a stiff nod before retreating toward the coat check. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely retrieve his ticket. He had just lied to one of the most powerful corporate raiders in the Pacific Northwest, and his boss, the woman who controlled his livelihood, was carrying his child. Sleep was impossible that night. David paced the worn carpet of his apartment, checking on a sleeping Chloe every 20 minutes. At 6 a.m. on Sunday, his phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was an unknown number, but the text message was brutally concise. "My driver is outside, 1400 First Avenue, the penthouse. Do not make him wait." David hastily arranged for Mrs. Gable, his elderly neighbor, to watch Chloe, claiming a sudden work crisis. 10 minutes later, he was sliding into the back of a sleek, blacked-out Maybach. The vehicle glided through the sleepy Seattle streets, arriving at an ultra-exclusive residential high-rise. A private elevator whisked David directly to the top floor, opening into a sprawling, multi-million-dollar penthouse that looked like a modern art museum. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying 360-degree view of the Puget Sound. Victoria was standing by the massive kitchen island, wrapped in a thick cashmere robe, nursing a mug of herbal tea. Without her makeup and tailored suits, she looked painfully exhausted. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath her eyes. "Sit down, David," she instructed quietly, gesturing to a velvet sofa in the sunken living room. David remained standing. "Victoria, we need to talk about what happened last night. You're pregnant. With my child. How is this even possible? We were careful, weren't we? I mean, nature found a way." Victoria interrupted, rubbing her temples. "The biological mechanics aren't the issue right now. The issue is Arthur Pendleton and the survival of Kensington Global." David stared at her, genuinely shocked. You just found out you're going to be a mother, and you're worried about a corporate board. You don't understand, Victoria snapped, her voice rising. My grandfather built this company, but he didn't trust my youth when he passed. The controlling shares, the ones that keep me in the CEO chair and stop vultures like Arthur from carving up the empire, are locked in a family trust. The board has a morality and stability clause. If I am deemed unfit, or if I cause a scandal that damages the company's stock, Arthur can trigger a vote of no confidence. He will strip me of my title, liquidate the assets, and fire thousands of people, including you. David felt the blood drain from his face once again. An out-of-wedlock pregnancy with a subordinate. He realized aloud, the terrifying puzzle clicking into place. It's an abuse of power. It's a massive HR violation. It's exactly the kind of scandal Arthur needs. Exactly, Victoria whispered, sinking onto the edge of the sofa. If this gets out, if Arthur discovers the truth about that night in my office, he will destroy us both. He will ruin my legacy, and he will blacklist you from every commercial real estate firm in the country. David sank into a leather armchair opposite her, burying his face in his hands. He thought of Chloe. He thought of the crippling debt Jessica had left him. If he lost his job, if he was blacklisted, they would lose the apartment. They would lose everything. So what do we do? David asked, his voice hollow. Do you want to keep the baby? Victoria looked up, her icy eyes swimming with unshed tears. I am 35 years old, David. I have given my entire life to this company. I have sacrificed relationships, friendships, and my own happiness to keep Kensington Global afloat. But this, she placed a trembling hand over her flat stomach. This is mine. I will not let Arthur take this choice away from me. I am keeping the child. David exhaled a long, shaky breath. Despite the terror gripping his chest, a strange, profound sense of protective instinct flared to life. He was already a father. He knew the fierce, all-consuming love that came with it. Okay, David said firmly, meeting her gaze. We keep the baby. But how do we survive Arthur? Victoria sat up straighter, the tears vanishing, replaced by the calculating brilliance that made her a billionaire. There is only one way to bypass the HR violation and neutralize Arthur's attack. We have to change the narrative before he can weaponize it. David leaned forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. Change the narrative? Victoria, there is no spinning this. I am your direct subordinate. Getting pregnant by an employee is a textbook violation of corporate ethics. Not if we were together before I became your direct boss, Victoria countered, her voice dropping into a steady, authoritative cadence. 3 years ago, you were working in the Chicago branch under the regional director. You didn't transfer to my direct command in Seattle until 14 months ago. Right, because my ex-wife left, and I needed the stability of the headquarters to raise Chloe. David confirmed. But what does that have to do with... We tell the board we have been in a committed, deeply private relationship for 3 years, Victoria stated smoothly. We tell them we met during a corporate retreat in Chicago, fell in love, and kept it a secret to avoid accusations of favoritism. We tell them my pregnancy isn't a careless mistake between a boss and a subordinate. It is the planned, joyous result of a long-term partnership. David stared at her as if she had grown a second head. Are you insane? You want to lie to the entire board of directors? We can't fake a 3-year relationship. We barely know each other. We have to, Victoria insisted, standing up and pacing across the Persian rug. It's the only narrative that neutralizes the ethics violation. If we are a committed couple, who fell in love before I was your direct supervisor. It becomes a heartwarming corporate romance rather than an abuse of power. The board will eat it up. The shareholders love family-oriented leadership. It will secure my trust and completely disarm Arthur. Victoria, you're not thinking straight, David argued, rising to his feet. What happens when they ask for proof? What happens when Arthur inevitably digs into our lives? We don't live together. We don't go out together. I have the 6-year-old daughter who knows exactly who you are. Her dad's terrifying boss. Victoria stopped pacing and turned to face him, her expression hardening into absolute resolve. Then we make it real. You and Chloe will move into this penthouse. We will be seen in public. We will attend charity dinners, holding hands, and we will announce our engagement by the end of the month. The room started to spin. A fake relationship, a fake engagement, moving his little girl into the sterile, high-altitude world of a billionaire CEO. No, David said firmly, shaking his head. Absolutely not. I am not turning my daughter's life upside down for a corporate cover-up. Chloe has already been abandoned by one mother figure. I will not introduce her to a fake stepmother, just so you can keep your CEO title. Victoria's eyes narrowed, but David saw the desperation flickering behind them. David, please. If Arthur wins, you lose your job. How will you provide for Chloe then? I'll find another job, David shot back. I'm good at what I do. You will be blacklisted, Victoria shouted, her voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows. She took a deep breath, fighting to regain her composure. David, I am not asking you to do this for free. If you agree to this, if you help me protect my company and our child, I will secure Chloe's future forever. David froze, his defensive posture faltering. What are you talking about? A trust fund, Victoria offered, stepping closer, her tone shifting to business. $5 million, placed in an irrevocable trust for Chloe, accessible when she turns 18. I will pay off your ex-wife's debt entirely. I will cover Chloe's private school tuition. All you have to do is play the role of my loving fiancé until the child is born and the board stabilizes. After that, we can announce a quiet, amicable separation. We will share custody. Chloe will be set for life, and you will never have to worry about money again. The numbers echoed in David's mind, heavy and intoxicating. $5 million, debt-free, no more panic attacks when the mortgage was due. No more guilt over not being able to afford the best for his little girl. He looked at Victoria, seeing the fierce, unyielding determination of a mother trying to protect her legacy and the child growing inside her. I won't agree to anything, David said slowly, his voice tight, until you meet her. If Chloe is uncomfortable, or if this feels wrong for her in any way, the deal is off. I don't care how much money you offer. Victoria exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. Agreed. Bring her to Discovery Park tomorrow afternoon. The following day was unseasonably sunny for Seattle. David sat on a wooden bench in Discovery Park, watching Chloe climb a wooden jungle gym. She was wearing her favorite yellow rain boots and a pink dinosaur jacket, her laughter ringing out across the playground. At precisely 2:40 p.m., a black town car pulled up to the edge of the park. Victoria stepped out. She had clearly tried to dress down, wearing designer dark denim, a cashmere sweater, and spotless white sneakers that cost more than David's car. She looked completely out of her element, scanning the playground with the apprehension of a soldier walking into a minefield. David stood up and waved her over. As she approached, her eyes locked onto Chloe. The cold, calculating CEO vanished entirely. Victoria's face softened in a way David hadn't seen since that rainy night in her office. Chloe, come here for a second. Sweetie, David called out. The little girl slid down the slide and ran over, her cheeks flushed with effort. She stopped abruptly when she saw the stranger standing next to her father. Chloe tilted her head, her bright green eyes studying Victoria with innocent suspicion. "Hi," Chloe said cautiously. "Are you my dad's boss? He says you're very bossy." David choked on a nervous cough, his face burning. "Chloe, I said she's the boss of the company. Not, well." To his absolute shock, Victoria let out a genuine, musical laugh. She knelt down on the muddy grass, completely ignoring the dirt staining her designer jeans, bringing herself to eye level with the 6-year-old. "Your dad is right, Chloe. I can be very bossy." Victoria smiled warmly. "My name is Victoria, but your dad is actually one of the smartest people I know. I came here today to see if maybe, outside of work, we could all be friends." Chloe scrutinized her for a long moment, then noticed a small, glittering pin on Victoria's lapel. "Is that a diamond?" "It is," Victoria nodded. "Would you like to hold it?" As the billionaire CEO and the little girl began a quiet, surprisingly gentle conversation about shiny rocks, David felt the heavy knot in his chest loosen just a fraction. Maybe this wouldn't be a complete disaster. Maybe Victoria had a heart underneath all that armor. But David was too focused on the budding connection to notice the dark gray sedan parked across the street. Sitting in the driver's seat, a private investigator lowered his telephoto lens, reviewing the crisp, high-definition photos of David, Chloe, and Victoria looking like a picture-perfect family. The investigator tapped his earpiece. "Mr. Pendleton? I have the photos. You were right. She's hiding something, and Henderson is right in the middle of it. I'm running a background check on the kid now." Within 72 hours, David's entire reality was dismantled and reconstructed in the sky. Packing up the modest 2-bedroom apartment felt like erasing a past life. Chloe was thrilled, treating the move like a grand adventure, completely oblivious to the crushing stakes hanging over her father's head. When they arrived at Victoria's penthouse on Tuesday evening, a team of professional movers had already unpacked their belongings, integrating their ordinary middle-class existence into a world of incomprehensible luxury. The transition was jarring. Chloe's brightly colored plastic toys now sat awkwardly beside priceless mid-century modern sculptures. Her dinosaur bedsheets were draped over a custom-built mahogany frame in a guest room larger than David's entire old apartment. Victoria had even hired a sweet, soft-spoken British nanny named Beatrice to assist when David and Victoria were at the office, eliminating the frantic late-night scramble for teenage sitters. That night, after Chloe was finally asleep, David found Victoria on the sprawling terrace. The Seattle skyline stretched out before them, glittering against the dark waters of the Puget Sound. She was wrapped in her thick cashmere robe, reviewing a tablet with a grim expression. "She's asleep," David announced, stepping out into the chilly night air. "Though I think she expects room service to bring her chocolate milk tomorrow morning." Victoria offered a faint, exhausted smile, setting the tablet down on a glass patio table. "Beatrice will have it ready. How are you holding up, David? I know this is happening fast." "Fast is an understatement," David muttered, leaning against the glass railing. "I feel like I've hijacked someone else's life. And tomorrow, we have to go into the office and convince thousands of employees that we're desperately in love. How exactly are we doing this?" Victoria's posture straightened, the CEO persona snapping back into place. "I spent the afternoon with Sarah Jenkins, our head of public relations. Tomorrow morning at 9, Page 6 will publish a leaked exclusive. Anonymous sources will confirm that the notoriously single billionaire, Victoria Kensington, has been quietly dating her senior acquisitions manager for 3 years. By noon, HR will issue a company-wide memo clarifying that our relationship predates your transfer to my direct command.
fully insulating us from the ethics and morality clauses.
David rubbed his eyes, the sheer audacity of the lie, making his stomach churn. And Arthur? Arthur will be furious, Victoria said smoothly. But he will be paralyzed. He cannot launch a hostile boardroom coup over a beloved corporate romance. The shareholders will eat it up. It humanizes me. A wealthy heiress finding true love with a hardworking, devoted single father. It's a public relations goldmine. Our stock will probably climb 3 points by Friday. But it's a lie, David reminded her gently, studying the tired lines around her eyes. Victoria, you are putting your entire legacy on a house of cards. If Arthur finds a single thread to pull, the whole thing collapses. Then we make sure there are no loose threads, she replied, her voice fierce. She walked over to him, reaching into the pocket of her robe. She pulled out a small velvet box and pressed it into his chest. Put this on me, David. And from tomorrow on, you do not take it off unless you are in the shower. David opened the box. Inside rested a blinding, flawless, 4-carat emerald-cut diamond ring set in platinum. It was heavy, ostentatious, and terrifying. With a trembling hand, he took the ring and slid it onto Victoria's left ring finger. The metal was cold against her skin. For a fleeting second, as their eyes met under the terrace lights, the boundary between the corporate arrangement and the raw, dangerous reality of their situation blurred. The following morning, the Kensington Global headquarters descended into absolute chaos. When David and Victoria walked through the gleaming glass doors of the lobby, hand in hand, the whispers followed them like a tidal wave. Employees stared openly. Phones buzzed in unison as the Page 6 article circulated through the building. David kept his shoulders back, forcing a relaxed, confident smile, his hand gripping Victoria's tightly. She played the part perfectly, leaning into him, offering the security desk a warm, radiant smile that left the guards speechless. But the real test came at 2 p.m. during the weekly executive briefing. The boardroom was packed with 20 of the highest-ranking directors, including Arthur Pendleton, as Victoria led the meeting, detailing the final integration steps for the Harbour Point project. The diamond on her finger caught the harsh fluorescent light, flashing like a warning beacon. Arthur sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, his hands steeped under his chin, his gray eyes locked onto David with terrifying intensity. He didn't ask a single question about the acquisition. He simply watched. When the meeting concluded and the room began to empty, Arthur deliberately blocked David's path near the coffee station. "Congratulations, Mr. Henderson," Arthur purred, his voice low enough that only David could hear. "A 3-year romance kept entirely in the shadows. Remarkable discipline. You must be quite the actor." "Thank you, Arthur," David replied evenly, forcing his heart rate to steady. "Victoria and I value our privacy." "Of course," Arthur smiled, a cold, predatory baring of teeth. "Privacy is a luxury, though I find it fascinating that a man so deeply in love never once mentioned this remarkable woman to his 6-year-old daughter until yesterday at Discovery Park." David's blood turned to ice. His breathing stopped. Arthur leaned in closer, the scent of expensive cigars and peppermint clinging to him. "Did you really think I wouldn't check, David? Did you think you could play in the deep end of the pool without the sharks noticing the blood? Enjoy the engagement party this weekend. I have a feeling it's going to be a highly memorable event." Before David could respond, Arthur patted his shoulder patronizingly and strolled out of the boardroom, leaving David trapped in a suffocating wave of panic. The official Kensington Global Engagement Gala was held that Saturday night at the Seattle Art Museum, effectively shutting down the entire downtown corridor with a fleet of black SUVs,
paparazzi, and security details. Victoria had spared no expense to sell the narrative. The grand foyer was transformed into a modern Eden, dripping with white wisteria and illuminated by hundreds of floating candles. David stood near the center of the room, in a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo. A glass of vintage champagne sweating in his hand. He felt like an imposter wearing a king's armor. Beside him, Victoria was a vision in a sweeping, backless silver gown, effortlessly charming a circle of Wall Street analysts and key shareholders. They laughed at her jokes. They toasted to their future. The public relations spin was working flawlessly. The stock had indeed bumped up, and the narrative of the billionaire and the single dad was dominating social media. But David couldn't shake the creeping dread clawing at his chest. Arthur Pendleton's words echoed relentlessly in his mind. "Did you really think I wouldn't check?" Arthur was present, standing near a towering abstract sculpture, sipping a martini and chatting amicably with the chief financial officer. Every time David glanced in his direction, Arthur offered a polite, chilling toast with his glass. "You're tense," Victoria murmured, leaning gracefully against David's shoulder, her smile bright for the cameras while her voice remained urgent. "Your jaw is locked. Relax. David, we are winning." "Arthur knows," David whispered back, keeping his smile plastered on his face as a photographer snapped a photo. "He had someone watching us at the park. He knows Chloe didn't know you until this week. He told me on Wednesday. Victoria, he's plotting something tonight." Victoria's silver gown rustled as she stiffened slightly, but her face remained a mask of glowing happiness. "Arthur has no proof. Circumstantial observations from a park bench will not hold up against a signed affidavit to HR and my controlling shares. Just hold the line." At 9:30 p.m., the string quartet stopped playing. The room quieted as Victoria's chief of staff tapped a microphone on the grand staircase. "Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, and friends," the chief of staff announced, "if I could direct your attention to our beautiful bride-to-be, Victoria Kensington, for a few words." The crowd applauded warmly. Victoria squeezed David's hand, a silent command for strength, and stepped forward to take the microphone. The spotlight hit her, making the silver fabric of her dress shimmer like liquid metal. Thank you all for being here," Victoria began, her voice echoing perfectly through the cavernous museum hall. "For years, I have given my heart and soul to Kensington Global. I believed that business was the only family I needed. But 3 years ago, I met a man who challenged me, who grounded me, and who showed me that true wealth is found in the people we love. David, you and Chloe have brought a light into my life that I never thought possible. Oh, please, spare us the daytime soap opera. Victoria!" The shrill, piercing voice cut through the silent hall like a gunshot. The entire room turned toward the entrance. The heavy glass doors were held open by security guards who looked utterly bewildered. Standing at the top of the marble steps, flanked by Arthur Pendleton, was a woman David had prayed to God he would never see again. She was thinner, her blonde hair cut into a sharp bob, wearing a tight crimson dress that screamed for attention. Her makeup was heavy, her eyes wild with a mixture of malice and theatrical sorrow. It was Jessica, his ex-wife. David dropped his champagne glass. It shattered against the marble floor, the sound ringing out in the stunned silence. His chest seized, oxygen failing to reach his lungs. No, this isn't possible. She's in Los Angeles. She hasn't called in 3 years. Victoria lowered the microphone, her icy blue eyes narrowing to slits as she instantly assessed the threat. She glanced at Arthur, who was standing behind Jessica, wearing a smile of pure, venomous triumph. "Who is this woman?"
A board member whispered loudly near the front. Jessica walked slowly down the marble stairs, her heels clicking aggressively in the silent room. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at David. "My name is Jessica Henderson," she announced, her voice carrying an expertly crafted tremor of heartbreak. "I am David's legal wife. We are not divorced, and that man stole my 6-year-old daughter and hid her from me so he could play house with his billionaire sugar mommy." Chaos erupted. The flashbulbs of the press, previously invited to capture a fairy tale romance, now fired in a blinding frenzy to capture the scandal of the decade. Shareholders gasped, stepping back from Victoria and David as if they were suddenly contagious. David was paralyzed. Not divorced. The papers had been filed. He had paid the lawyer. But the crushing realization hit him. Jessica had vanished before signing the final notary decrees. He had assumed the state had finalized the abandonment clause, but he had never received the final stamp. Legally, she might be telling the truth. Victoria grabbed David's arm, her grip bruising. The armor was fully back, cold and terrifying. "Did you know?" she hissed, her voice barely audible over the shouting reporters. "No!" David choked out, staring in horror as Jessica began weeping for the cameras. "Victoria, I swear to God, I thought the divorce was finalized 3 years ago." Arthur stepped forward, acting the part of a concerned peacemaker, though his eyes danced with victory. "Victoria, this is highly disturbing," Arthur projected, ensuring the board members heard every word. "An affair with a married subordinate, kidnapping a child from her mother? This violates every ethical standard of Kensington Global. I am calling an emergency board meeting on Monday morning to trigger the morality clause." Jessica locked eyes with David through the sea of flashing cameras. She mouthed 2 silent words. "I win." David realized then that Arthur hadn't just found a loose thread. He had bought a wrecking ball, and he was about to smash David's daughter, Victoria's company, and their unborn child into dust. Security personnel moved with the synchronized precision of a SWAT team. Before the flashes of the paparazzi could fully blind them, Victoria's private detail swarmed the grand staircase, forming a human barricade between the screaming reporters and the stage. David felt a heavy hand grab his shoulder, yanking him backward through a concealed service door behind the abstract sculpture exhibit. The heavy steel door slammed shut, cutting off the chaotic roar of the gala. The silence in the service corridor was instantly replaced by the rapid clicking of Victoria's heels on the concrete floor. She didn't say a word. Her face was a mask of pure, terrifying calculation. She marched toward the loading dock where her armored Maybach was already idling, the engine purring like a caged beast. David scrambled into the back seat beside her, his mind spinning out of control. The vehicle shot out of the museum's underground garage, instantly flanked by 2 black SUVs. "Victoria," David started, his voice trembling as the adrenaline crashed through his system. "I swear to you, I signed the papers. My lawyer in Seattle filed the interstate documents with the Los Angeles County clerk. I paid the retainer. I thought it was done. She hasn't called, texted, or sent a single birthday card to Chloe in 3 years." Victoria raised a single, perfectly manicured finger, silencing him instantly. She had an encrypted satellite phone pressed to her ear. "Hey, Harrison," she snapped into the receiver, her tone venomous. "I want the entire legal crisis team in my penthouse in exactly 20 minutes. Wake them up. If anyone complains, fire them and call their replacements. I want the sealing records for a California state divorce filing under the name Jessica Henderson. And get PR to issue a blanket denial, no comments, total media blackout until dawn." She dropped the phone onto the leather console and finally turned to look at David. The streetlights flickered across her face, illuminating the exhaustion and the sheer panic hiding just beneath her billionaire armor. If she is legally your wife. David, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. Arthur has everything he needs: adultery, corporate fraud, and the gross violation of the morality clause. The board will vote me out at 8 o'clock on Monday morning, and my grandfather's company will be dismantled by noon. They arrived at the penthouse to find the usually pristine living room transformed into a chaotic war room. Beatrice, the British nanny, had wisely locked herself in the guest wing with a sleeping Chloe, completely isolating the 6-year-old from the nightmare unfolding outside. 6 of the most expensive corporate attorneys in the Pacific Northwest were huddled around the massive marble kitchen island. Harrison Reed, Kensington Global's lead counsel, a sharp, silver-haired man in a wrinkled Armani suit, was frantically typing on a laptop. "Well?" Victoria demanded, throwing her silver clutch onto the counter. "Tell me Henderson is officially divorced." Harrison stopped typing and slowly looked up, adjusting his tortoiseshell glasses. "It's a catastrophic clerical loophole. Victoria, Mr. Henderson filed the paperwork correctly. However, California law requires a final notarized signature from the respondent if there is a minor child involved and no formal custody hearing was attended. Jessica Henderson was served the papers, but she vanished before signing the final decree. The lawyer assumed it defaulted after 6 months, but the LA County clerk flagged it due to the missing custody affidavit. The file has been sitting in bureaucratic purgatory for 3 years. Legally speaking, they are still married." David sank onto a velvet bar stool, burying his face in his hands. The air in the penthouse felt dangerously thin. "She doesn't want Chloe," he muttered, his voice hollow. "When she left, she told me motherhood was a prison. She packed her bags while Chloe was crying in her crib. She didn't even look back. She's only here because Arthur paid her." Of course Arthur paid her," Victoria sneered, pacing the length of the floor-to-ceiling windows. "He tracked her down, funded her dramatic entrance, and promised her a massive payout from the settlement he plans to extort from me. Arthur is a shock, but he is predictable. So, what is our counter move?" Harrison asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "We can't finalize a divorce by Monday morning. If she takes the stand at the emergency board meeting, she will paint Mr. Henderson as a predator and you as a homewrecker." Victoria stopped pacing. She looked out at the glittering Seattle skyline, her reflection ghosting against the reinforced glass. She placed a protective hand over her stomach, a subtle gesture that only David noticed. The fear in her eyes was suddenly replaced by a cold, burning fury. "We do what Kensington Global does best," Victoria announced, turning back to the room with a chilling smile. "We launch a hostile takeover. Harrison, get me Jack Callahan on the line. I want our best private investigators tearing into every single second of Jessica Henderson's life in Los Angeles over the last 3 years. If she has jaywalked, I want a photo of it. People who abandon their children to chase fame do not live clean lives." David looked up, a spark of hope fighting through his despair. "You think you can find dirt on her before Monday? I don't just want dirt. David," Victoria corrected, her voice dripping with absolute authority. "I want leverage. I want to build a cage so tight around Jessica that she will beg to sign those divorce papers." Sunday morning broke over Seattle with a heavy, oppressive gray fog, perfectly mirroring the suffocating tension inside the penthouse. David hadn't slept a single minute. He had spent the early hours of the morning sitting by Chloe's bed, watching his daughter breathe, terrified that Jessica would somehow march through the door with a police escort to take her away. At precisely 9:09 a.m., the private elevator chimed. Jack Callahan, a heavily built ex-CIA operative who served as Victoria's shadow fixer, stepped into the foyer, holding a thick manila folder. Victoria was already waiting at the dining table, nursing her fourth black espresso. She was dressed in a sharp, slate-gray blazer, the corporate warlord fully resurrected. David stood nervously behind her chair. "Tell me you have a loaded gun in that folder, Jack!" Victoria demanded, skipping the pleasantries. Callahan dropped the heavy folder onto the mahogany table. It hit the wood with a satisfying, meaty thud. "I have a nuclear arsenal, Ms. Kensington. Jessica Henderson's life in Los Angeles is a spectacular train wreck." He opened the file, sliding glossy photographs and bank statements across the table. David had leaned over, his stomach churning as he looked at the evidence of his ex-wife's disastrous choices. "Oh, she didn't make it in Hollywood," Callahan explained gruffly. "She got mixed up with an underground poker ring in West Hollywood about 2 years ago. Currently, she owes roughly $400,000 to a very unpleasant loan shark named Victor Volkov. She has 2 DUIs that were quietly swept under the rug by a disgraced lawyer, and she's facing active eviction from a miserable studio apartment in Burbank." Callahan slid a printed bank wire transfer toward Victoria. "And here is the smoking gun. 3 days ago, an offshore shell company registered in the Cayman Islands wired exactly $50,000 into Jessica's checking account. The shell company traces back to a subsidiary managed by Arthur Pendleton's wealth management firm. It was a down payment to get her to Seattle and crash the gala." A slow, predatory smile spread across Victoria's face. She looked at David, her icy blue eyes flashing with triumph. "Arthur is getting sloppy. He used corporate-adjacent funds to finance a personal attack on a CEO. That is a direct violation of the Fiduciary Trust Act." "It gets better," Callahan added, tapping a photograph of Jessica sitting in a dive bar, talking to a silver-haired man. "Arthur didn't just pay her. He promised her full custody of the kid. Why? Because if she has custody of Chloe, she can sue Mr. Henderson for retroactive child support and demand a cut of the $5 million trust fund you supposedly set up for the girl. Arthur is using your own PR spin against you." David felt a blinding wave of rage wash over him. The fear that had paralyzed him since the gala completely evaporated, replaced by the fierce, violent instinct of a father protecting his child. He slammed his fist against the table, rattling the espresso cups. "Set up the meeting," David ordered, his voice harder and deeper than Victoria had ever heard it. He looked directly at the billionaire CEO, stripping away the dynamic of boss and subordinate. "I am not letting that woman anywhere near my daughter. Set up a meeting with Jessica. Now." 3 hours later, David and Victoria sat in the private dining room of the Four Seasons Hotel. The room was swept for listening devices, the doors guarded by Callahan's men. At exactly 1 p.m., Jessica strutted into the room, wearing a smug, victorious grin and a designer trench coat she clearly couldn't afford. She sat across from them, crossing her legs and examining her nails. "I have to admit, David," Jessica sneered, ignoring Victoria entirely. "I didn't expect you to upgrade so drastically. From a suffocating, boring life with me to the bed of a billionaire. Bravo. But I want my daughter back, and I want half of everything you're about to make from this little corporate charade." David didn't yell. He didn't flinch. He slowly opened the manila folder and slid the first photograph across the table. It was a picture of Jessica, handing a thick envelope of cash to Viktor Volkov's enforcer, outside a Los Angeles casino. Jessica's smug smile instantly vanished. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and trembling beneath her heavy makeup. "You owe $400,000 to the Russian mob." "Jessica," David stated, his voice ice-cold. "Arthur Pendleton gave you $50,000. That won't even cover the interest to stop them from breaking your legs." He slid the wire transfer document across the table, next
We also have the wire transfer proving Arthur bribed you to commit corporate espionage and commit perjury regarding your intent for custody. I have a team of lawyers upstairs drafting a restraining order, a criminal extortion complaint, and an abandonment finalized decree. Jessica swallowed hard, her eyes darting frantically toward the door. You can't prove. I can prove whatever I want. Victoria finally spoke, leaning forward, the heavy diamond on her finger catching the light. She exuded a terrifying, effortless power. I am a billionaire, Jessica. I can tie you up in litigation for the next 10 years. I can make sure the LAPD and Mr. Volkov know exactly where you are sleeping every single night. Or, you can take the pen resting in front of you. Victoria slid a sleek Mont Blanc pen and a stack of legal documents across the table. This is a finalized, backdated divorce decree. Alongside it is a full, irrevocable surrender of your parental rights to Chloe, Victoria explained smoothly. If you sign them right now, I will personally wire $500,000 to your offshore account. You can pay off the Russians, disappear back to California, and pretend this never happened. Jessica stared at the pen as if it were a venomous snake. She looked at David, searching for the weak, easily manipulated man she had left 3 years ago. But David stared back with a cold, unyielding resolve. Sign it, Jessica, David said softly. Because if you don't, I will personally make sure Arthur Pendleton goes to federal prison for bribery, and you go with him as a co-conspirator. You don't want to be a mother. You want a lifeline. Take it. Jessica's hands shook violently as she picked up the pen. Without reading a single word of the documents, she scrawled her signature on every page, effectively erasing herself from David and Chloe's life forever. Victoria carefully collected the papers, sliding them into her briefcase with a satisfying click. Thank you, Jessica. The funds will clear in 10 minutes. As Jessica fled the room in silence, David let out a massive, shuddering breath, burying his face in his hands as the relief washed over him. Victoria stood up, walking around the table. For the first time all weekend, her corporate armor melted. She gently placed a hand on his shoulder, sliding her fingers into his hair. "We have the divorce," Victoria whispered, her eyes burning with fierce determination. "Now, we go to the board meeting tomorrow morning, and we slaughter Arthur Pendleton." Monday morning arrived with the heavy but suffocating atmosphere of an impending execution. The 48th floor of the Kensington Tower was entirely locked down. At exactly 8 o'clock, the heavy mahogany doors of the executive boardroom swung shut, sealing Victoria, David, and 12 of the most powerful board members inside. Arthur Pendleton sat at the head of the long table, a position usually reserved for the CEO. A sickeningly confident smile played on his lips as he steepled his fingers, looking across the polished wood at Victoria and David. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," Arthur began, his voice dripping with false solemnity. "We are gathered here today to address a catastrophic breach of trust, as you all witnessed at the gala on Saturday. Our CEO has been engaging in a deeply inappropriate, fraudulent relationship with a subordinate. Furthermore, this subordinate, Mr. Henderson, is a married man whose legal wife has come forward claiming parental kidnapping and emotional distress. This behavior grossly violates the morality clause of the Kensington Family Trust. I move for an immediate vote of no confidence to strip Victoria Kensington of her title and operational control." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Several older board members nodded gravely, their eyes avoiding Victoria's gaze. David felt his pulse pounding in his ears, but he maintained a perfectly neutral expression. He reached under the table and took Victoria's hand, lacing his fingers through hers. Her grip was ironclad. Victoria stood up slowly, commanding the attention of the entire room without raising her voice. Her tailored, navy blue Tom Ford suit was immaculate, her posture radiating absolute authority. Your concern for corporate ethics is truly inspiring, Arthur, Victoria stated, her voice slicing through the thick tension like a scalpel. However, your motion is based on a theatrical performance funded by your own illicit ambitions, rather than factual reality. Arthur chuckled patronizingly. Theatrical? Jessica Henderson's tears seemed very real to the press. Victoria, the SEC and our shareholders will not look kindly on a homewrecker running a multi-billion-dollar empire. Jessica Henderson is not legally married to David, Victoria countered smoothly, reaching into her sleek leather briefcase. Victoria extracted a thick stack of finalized legal documents and tossed them onto the center of the mahogany table. They landed with a heavy, definitive thud. Those are the finalized, backdated divorce decrees authenticated by the state of California, Victoria announced, her icy blue eyes locking onto Arthur. Alongside them is a fully executed surrender of parental rights, signed by Jessica Henderson yesterday afternoon. David is a legally single man with sole custody of his daughter. Therefore, the morality clause has not been breached. Our relationship remains entirely within the bounds of corporate compliance. Arthur's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, waving a dismissive hand. A last-minute legal scrambling does not excuse the massive PR nightmare you have triggered. The scandal is already out there. The only scandal in this room belongs to you, Arthur. David finally spoke, his voice echoing with cold precision. David stood up, sliding a second, much thinner folder across the table. It slid perfectly to a stop right in front of the board's chief financial officer. What you are looking at is a verified wire transfer of $50,000, David explained, watching the blood slowly drain from Arthur's face. The funds originated from a shell company tied to Arthur Pendleton's private wealth management firm. The recipient was Jessica Henderson. Arthur deliberately used corporate-adjacent funds to bribe a hostile third party to commit perjury, orchestrate corporate espionage, and crash a sanctioned company event in an attempt to manipulate the stock and seize control of this board. The boardroom erupted into absolute chaos. The chief financial officer turned pale as he reviewed the banking details. Directors who had been nodding along with Arthur just moments ago were now shouting in outrage, pushing their chairs away from the disgraced executive as if he were suddenly highly contagious. Arthur's mouth opened and closed silently. The silver-haired predator had finally been caught in a trap he could not buy his way out of. "This is absurd," Arthur stammered, his voice rising in genuine panic. "These documents are fabricated. This is a setup." "I have already forwarded the unredacted files to the Securities and Exchange Commission, as well as the federal prosecutor's office," Victoria noted, checking her diamond-encrusted Rolex with casual indifference. "Federal agents are likely pulling into the parking garage as we speak. You have violated fiduciary duty. Arthur, if you do not resign your seat on this board immediately and surrender your voting shares to the Kensington Trust, I will personally ensure you spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary." Defeat washed over Arthur Pendleton like a physical blow. His hands trembled as he looked around the room, finding zero allies among the horrified board members. Without a word, he grabbed his pen, hastily scribbled his resignation on a legal pad, and fled the boardroom, effectively banishing himself from the empire he had tried to steal. Silence descended upon the executive suite once more. The remaining board members looked at Victoria with a renewed sense of profound, terrified respect. "Now," Victoria said, smoothing her blazer and sitting back down, "if there are no further interruptions, I believe we have a highly profitable quarter to discuss." Hours later, the sun set over the Seattle skyline, casting a warm golden glow across the empty penthouse.
David stood on the terrace, watching the ferries cross the Puget Sound. The nightmare was finally over. The company was safe. Chloe was safe. Footsteps approached from behind. Victoria wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her cheek against his back. The heavy cashmere of her sweater was soft against his shirt. "You played a dangerous game today, Mr. Henderson," Victoria murmured playfully. David turned around, pulling her close. The billionaire CEO was gone, leaving only the woman he had inexplicably fallen in love with in the middle of a corporate war. He gently rested his hand against her stomach, a profound sense of peace settling over him. "We played it together," David whispered, leaning in. "And I think it's time we stop pretending this is just a PR spin." Victoria's eyes sparkled with genuine happiness. "I couldn't agree more. What an absolutely explosive ending to this corporate roller coaster." David and Victoria managed to outsmart the ultimate boardroom shock and protect their growing family against all odds. Their fake romance turned into a beautiful, unbreakable reality, proving that sometimes the greatest risks yield the most incredible rewards. If this dramatic journey kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Share this video with your friends to see if they could have survived Arthur's vicious corporate trap. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, high-stakes stories. You won't want to miss what we have coming next.